Is it water with the sheep in the box?
A while ago, I made a video exploring the political and philosophical implications of the world of Harry Potter. I did briefly cover race and some of the missteps made over the years in that video, but there's something that's been playing on my mind since then, and I need to share it so I can get it out of my brain. In my opinion, some of the lore about international wizards, and specifically wizard schools, seems kind of racist. Is this a hot take? I don't know. It's certainly not timely or relevant, but as J.K. Rowling has recently published a book that goes out of its way to claim that actually caring about harmful stereotypes and offensive representations in media is dumb and cringe, and actually the real victims in all this are the billionaire authors who are victimized by the woke left cancelling them for the things they said and did, well, I thought perhaps it was worth a revisit. Looking at it from a purely objective standpoint, without any prior knowledge of its author or the discourse around her, J.K. Rowling's body of work has some rather concerning issues with, and portrayals of, minority groups. I mean, this is obvious, right? The single prominent black character is called Kingsley Shacklebolt, and the one Asian character is called Cho Chang, fuck's sake. Oh, and let's not forget that the person who played the character of Lavender Brown was black until she was supposed to be dating Ron, a ginger white guy, and was recast and race swapped for what I'm sure are totally legit and not at all concerning reasons. But yeah, whatever, cold take, I get it. I made a whole feature-length video about this ages ago, but this is different. See, in that video, I talk mostly about the lore of the actual books and movies, but today I actually want to talk a little bit about the additional lore added to the series by J.K. Rowling since the books and movies stopped being released. That's right, we're going to be taking a little look at some of the absolutely wild shit on what used to be called Pottermore but is now called Wizarding World to tie in with those dogshit Fantastic Beasts movies. Specifically in this video, we'll be talking about portrayals of non-white wizards and wizard culture, for lack of a better term. I mean, what, you think that the sort of person who's signed off on, doubled down on, and has thus far refused to condemn shit like this, and included similar, though less egregious, descriptions and depictions in her books, and further mocks people who criticizes it, could be in any way prejudiced towards racial and ethnic groups? No, that's impossible. I mean, it's not like there was a literal Star of David on the floor of Gringotts Bank, right? That would be absurdly on the nose, not to mention offensive, especially if you'd contributed to the massive media blitz against the centre-left political figure, helping to smear him as anti-Semitic, in part because he probably would have taxed you on your literal billions of pounds, or stopped you attempting to claim vast parts of Scottish countryside as your personal exclusive property. But alright, let's talk about African wizards, according to J.K. Rowling, shall we? Taken from her writing on the same website that once asked the important question of whether or not slavery is bad and came down in the middle somehow. This should be fun. First off, we have to talk about the ways in which Rowling actively plays into lazy but sadly prevalent stereotypes surrounding the African continent and its people, in much the same way as her goblins played into anti-Semitic stereotypes about avaricious, ugly, hook-nosed creatures obsessed with money and who exist parallel to, but in opposition to, the mainstream. So how does she do that? Well, in a number of ways, but let's focus on two main ones. One, Africa as a monolith. The moronic, stupid idea that all of Africa, one of, if not the most culturally diverse places in the world, is somehow a single, simple, monolithic culture, unlike, say, Britain and France, which are culturally distinct because, well, I don't want to make any accusations, but I mean, it seems pretty clear, right? Two, the myth of the Dark Continent. The racist and ignorant idea that Africa and its inhabitants were and continue to be uncivilized and, if anything, benefited from colonialism due to this. The classic colonial bringing civilization to the savages talking point beloved of British Empire apologists like Boris Johnson, or the multiple times PragerU did it, being a prime example of this. The second point first then, let's read, shall we? Although Africa has a number of smaller wizarding schools, there is only one that has stood the test of time, at least 1,000 years, and achieved an enviable international reputation, Uagadou. The largest of all wizarding schools, it welcomes students from all over the enormous continent. The only address ever given is Mountains of the Moon. Visitors speak of a stunning edifice carved out of the mountainside and shrouded in mist, so that it sometimes appears to simply float in midair. Much, some would say all, magic originated in Africa, and Uagadou graduates are especially well versed in astronomy, alchemy, and self-transfiguration. The wand is a European invention, and while African witches and wizards have adopted adopted it as a useful tool in the last century, many spells are cast simply by pointing the finger or through hand gestures. To me, this is pretty telling. For a start, we have the magic began in Africa part, which I suppose is supposed to be a clever reference to the cradle of civilization, paralleling the fact that humanity, by and large, evolved and originated in Africa. Yeah, pretty cute, I guess, but this does raise a few questions, including, well, what the fuck does that even mean? Was magic invented by who? Why is it seemingly genetic? And so on. Likewise, we have to ask what the fuck is meant exactly by the wandless magic stuff. Now, the way magic and its lore works in what is apparently called the wizarding world now has always been inconsistent and just made up on the fly. Elements like silent spellcasting, for example, just get dropped into the story in the second to last book for little to no reason and actually don't make much sense when you think about it, and zombies get mentioned offhand in book 1 and then actually they're called inferi, not zombies, by book 5, and they're only coming about now. But something about this wandless magic stuff just really rubs me up the wrong way. The fact that in the wizarding world something as basic and fundamental to the world of Harry Potter as a magic wand wasn't some kind of universal or basic tool, but instead a Western invention and was brought over during colonialism. There are so many questions this raises, including what the wizards were doing during colonialism, what effect it had on them, and so on. But the main takeaway, in my opinion, is quite simply that this seems to very closely mirror, if not directly represent, the at best racially insensitive and ignorant idea that the colonizers brought civilization to the savages, as I mentioned, with the indigenous people, if anything, actually benefiting from centuries of brutal imperialism, exploitation, slavery, and so on. And then there's the Africa as a monolith thing, which I did make an unscripted ranty video about ages ago, but it's disappointing to see it still being used just a few years ago now. Within the wizarding world, the UK, France, and Russia each get their own magic school in comparison to Africa. All of Africa gets one school. A single school for the entire continent. The second largest continent by both population and landmass, by the way. A continent made up of 54 separate countries, each with their own individual cultures, languages, and traditions. Indeed, the continent of Africa is one of the most linguistically diverse places in the world, and up to 2,000 languages are spoken there. Seems like a few issues of communication might arise in a place like a school that caters to all these people, but that's just me. And of course, each country contains multiple varying cultures on top of that, in part because a lot of the borders in Africa were arbitrarily drawn by the colonizing powers in complete ignorance of or apathy towards the existing peoples and cultures, and the lands they held sacred or even just who lived there, hence why a few of the borders are straight lines, of course. In Europe, borders are messy and complicated because for the most part they formed over hundreds of years of conflict and compromise. A straight line on a map is often a sign of violent repression. See also the state borders over in the US. And then there's the origin of the name Uagadou itself, which, oh boy. So we're told that the name is pronounced Uagadou, as I've been pronouncing it, which just so happens to be identical to the Kingdom of Uagadou, the name given for the ancient Ghanaian Empire covering what is now modern-day Mali, Mauritania, and Senegal, which for those non-geography heads out there is an area nowhere near modern-day Uganda, but you know, it's African, I guess. Alternatively, it could originate from Ouagadougou, the capital of Burkina Faso, but again, Burkina Faso is not Uganda and again is situated quite some distance away from it. It could also be a reference to the hit song Agadoo, but I find that unlikely. You can really see why people accuse Rowling of being a little bit ignorant when she decided to add this bit of lore, can't you? If there's one thing Rowling used to be good at before she started writing exclusively self-insert cringe fanfiction where she is the innocent victim of LGBTQ+ people existing in public, it's making surface-level hints at real-world European mythology and folklore, like Dobby, for example, being a reference to ancient Celtic legends about household spirits, a theme that applies to many of the magical creatures that make an appearance throughout the books, to the point where it does genuinely seem like this is an interest of hers, though admittedly she does change or misunderstand a lot of the myths and legends surrounding these creatures. The problem with this isn't really evident within the main 7 books for a number of reasons, the main one being that British and Northern European folklore seems to be something Rowling is relatively knowledgeable about, so outside of a couple of easily made mistakes, it's for the most part pretty harmless. However, the problem comes in when she tries to add lore to her stories covering non-European folklore. It tends to not go well, shall we say. Indeed, it does actually seem like she was a little bit lost when it came to African African mythology specifically, and Native American folklore. Well, we'll get into that in a minute. As a case study, let's look at the simple matter of the location of Uagadou, shall we? Uagadou is situated in the Mountains of the Moon, which seems like an indigenous story based in ancient, presumably African legend at first glance. You may be shocked to discover, in fact, that it is not. In fact, the Mountains of the Moon is an ancient Greek term referring to a legendary mountain or mountain range in East Africa at the source of the Nile River. Of course, the ancient Egyptians were a huge part of the ancient political age, and a lot of people of the ancient world were curious about the source of the mighty river that gave it its prominence and power, the Nile. Most of the early speculation was on the part of ancient Greek geographers, and indeed, according to some reports, it is speculated that a number of expeditions up the Nile failed to find the source. Eventually, a merchant named Diogenes claimed that he had found it and that it flowed from a group of massive mountains into a series of large lakes, a common belief about rivers for an extremely long time, as you may have seen on old maps. He reported the natives called this mountain range the Mountains of the Moon. These reports were accepted as true by most Greek and Roman geographers, most notably by Ptolemy, who produced maps that indicated the reported location of the mountains. Late Arab geographers, despite having far more knowledge of Africa, also presumed the report was fact and included the mountains in the same location given by Ptolemy. It was not until modern times that Europeans resumed their search for the source of the Nile. The Scottish explorer James Bruce, who travelled to Gojam, Ethiopia in 1770, investigated the source of the Nile there. He identified the Mountains of the Moon with Mount Amadamit, which he described surrounded the source of the Lesser Abbe in two semicircles like a new moon, and seemed by their shape to deserve the name of the Mountains of the Moon, such as was given by antiquity to mountains in the neighbourhood of which the Nile was supposed to rise. James Grant and John Speke in 1862 sought the source of the Nile in the Great Lakes region. Henry Morton Stanley finally found glacier-capped mountains, possibly fitting Diogenes' description, in 1889. They had eluded European explorers for so long due to often being shrouded in mist. Today known as the Rwenzori Mountains, covering an area in both Uganda and the Democratic Republic of Congo, the peaks are the source of some of the Nile's waters, but only a small fraction, and Diogenes would have had to cross the Nile to reach them, which seems unlikely. Many modern scholars doubt that these were the Mountains of the Moon described by Diogenes, some holding that his reports were wholly fabricated. G.W.B. Huntingford suggested in 1940 that the Mountain of the Moon should be identified with Mount Kilimanjaro, despite Kilimanjaro being a solitary mountain rather than a mountain range and not feeding the Nile at all, and was absolutely ridiculed in J. Oliver Thompson's History of Ancient Geography, published in 1948. Academics posting drama reaction content for decades now, you'll love to see it. Huntingford later noted that he was not alone in this theory, citing Sir Harry Johnson in 1911 and Dr. Gervais Matthew later in 1963 having made the same identification. O.G.S. Crawford identified this range with the Mount Abunu Yosef area in the Amhara region of Ethiopia. So, what are we to make of this? Well, for a start, it makes very little sense. According to Rowling, Uagadou is in Uganda, though this was only revealed after people accused her of being deliberately vague in order to paint Africa as a homogeneous monoculture, and is shrouded in cloud and mist, which pretty much places it in the Rwenzori Mountains, on the Uganda side, obviously, but as we just established, this is generally considered unlikely by most modern scholars. Now, obviously, the immediate response to this will be something along the lines of, well, it's just made up, much like other fictional places in the Harry Potter universe, like Hogsmeade or whatever, and that's fine, but it is a little weird that it's widely speculated to be a very real place in the same kind of area, but somehow is right next to it or something. If anything, keeping it vague would actually have been better as far as lore is concerned, but this is just fandom pedantry, in my opinion, and whilst funny and kind of dumb on Rowling's part, doesn't actually make a huge difference. No, what is actually pretty disgusting, in my opinion, is the way that this mythological place, that is the continent of Africa's only significant contribution to the lore of the wizarding world, isn't even an indigenous African story or paying respects to literally any mythology or folklore originating in Africa, of which there is a lot, but is instead based on a Greek legend that persisted throughout the ages and was exploited by so-called explorers and colonizers in order to justify their invasion and trespass into African land during the scramble for Africa in the 18th and 19th centuries. In essence, in the one opportunity Rowling had, or chose to have, I guess, to represent the diversity and fascinating mythology and folklore of an oft overlooked or dismissed entire continent containing countless peoples and cultures, and she just chose instead to celebrate a European story about Africa rather than looking for actually legit pre-existing local folklore after centuries of Africans being erased erased from their own history. And that's just sad, but in my opinion, rather illustrative of the way she views other cultures. For example, whilst we're here, it's worth pointing out that Joanne Karen Rowling also managed to massively misrepresent and offend Native Americans and their culture as well, which is actually kind of impressive, to be honest. For a start, much like Africa, she smashes the cultures of multiple native tribes, many of which actively contradict and have histories of conflict with one another, together, because, I mean, they're pretty much all the same, right? For example, she got into a lot of hot water over basically saying that the tradition of the skinwalker was actually just stupid muggle people not understanding animagi, or, in Rowling's own words, a legend grew up around the Native American animagi that they had sacrificed close family members to gain their powers of transformation. In fact, the majority of animagi assumed animal forms to escape persecution or to hunt for the tribe. Such derogatory rumours often originated with no-mag medicine men who were sometimes faking magical powers themselves and fearful of exposure. Literally just saying that Native American traditions and beliefs are full of shit. Honestly, just incredible stuff. Hilariously ignorant. And of course, Rowling has apparently used the term Native American culture in a serious manner before, basically showing her to be completely ignorant of the complexity and diversity of cultures throughout the indigenous peoples of the Americas. For reference, there are 574 different Native American tribes recognized by the US government, each of which has its own unique traditions, culture, and, in many cases, language. Native American culture probably covers them all though, right? Just like Africa, those people are basically all the same, unlike France and the UK, which are totally unique and deserve their own schools. Oh yeah, did I mention that just like Africa, the entirety of North America has a single wizard school? She heavily stereotypes the Native Americans, claiming that the Native American wizarding community was particularly gifted in animal and plant magic, which some have claimed perpetrates the misrepresentative stereotype of the spiritual Native American being at one with nature. And of course she repeats her wandless magic trick because I guess indigenous peoples were all fucking useless before the good old Europeans came in and gave them technology, eh? Rowling claims that the absence of a wand is the most glaring difference between magic practiced by Native Americans and the wizards of Europe, although apparently Native American wizards were all capable of complexity with their aforementioned innate natural power. Rowling explains they lack the sophisticated ability permitted by a wand which originated in Europe. Those savages, am I right? Also, according to Rowling, this was a country with few amenities. No, tell us what you really think about indigenous peoples, Joanne. Obviously, this feeds into the argument and ignorant opinions of early modern colonizers who, incidentally, Rowling whitewashes as explorers, who argued that uncivilized Native Americans needed saving from themselves. An idea that eventually led to the infamously brutal residential schools, the motto of which was to kill the Indian to save the man, at which a mass grave was discovered very recently. Speaking of schools, let's talk about Ilvermorny. How did it come about? Oh, you're gonna like this. On what used to be called Pottermore, Rowling tells the story of... Actually, you know what? I'm just gonna quote from the Salon article that covered this here. It's the 17th century of Iseult Sayre, a magical Irish lass who sails with the Puritans on the Mayflower to land at Plymouth Rock, Massachusetts. Running away to the mountains, she finds a magical sidekick, a Pukwudgie she promptly names William, only to stumble across 3 young white colonial settlers in various states of distress and ends up co-founding a magical school with them. Pukwudgie becomes one of the 4 houses at Ilvermorny, each of which is named after a magical totem animal. You can now go into the Pottermore site and take a quiz that will sort you into one of the houses. So, no magical human natives in the story, like maybe a couple from the tribe known as the Massachusetts, as in the state of. How about the Wampanoag, who populated the land nearest the Plymouth colony? Rowling never mentions natives living in the area, let alone the fact that things didn't go so well for them once the colonists stopped being grateful. Indeed, she gives us a Pukwudgie, an anthropomorphic creature from Wampanoag lore, but which in her hands becomes a resentful, English-speaking voluntary bondservant who refuses to tell Iseult his given name, and so she names him William after her father. Together they forge a unique friendship that sounds suspiciously like the Lone Ranger and Tonto with a dash of Herman Friday, precisely because it echoes stereotypes regarding good guide Indians as interlocutors, and specifically the history of Tisquantum or Squantum Toronto, an English-speaking Native American of the Pawtuxet tribe who escaped slavery and helped the first Pilgrims survive, much in the same way that William the Pukwudgie helps Iseult by showing them how to hunt, fish, gather wild plants, and cultivate domestic seeds. Honestly, this is absolutely wild to me. Rowling uncritically replicates the power structures enacted by British colonialism, claims that magic was chaotic until the white people show up, and appropriates native traditions while erasing native peoples. In short, it misunderstands American culture, geography, and history, and there are so many errors that they undermine the integrity of the story while just plain confusing readers. Oh, and of course many of the same issues plaguing the African wizard lore also apply here. And then there's the school houses. Oh boy. So there are 4 main houses. Let's go through them, shall we? In traditional Wampanoag culture, Pukwudgies are spirit-like creatures known for tormenting and murdering the people they lure into the forest. In Rowling's world, this creature of folklore is instead described as a grumbling goblin-esque creature that serve as the Ilvermorny security guards. The horned serpent is considered the symbol for wisdom and divination in the folklore of a number of Native American tribes, specifically from the southeastern woodlands and Great Lakes regions. In Rowling's world, it is essentially a shiny water snake, so it has links to Parseltongue and speaks in cryptic rhymes. Oh god, the Thunderbird. Okay, so originally Thunderbirds are representations of strength and majesty in a variety of stories from Ojibwe and Menominee tribes in Algonquin mythology. However, in Rowling's world, the Thunderbird is hardly mentioned beyond being one of the founders of the school, a white boy, remember, his favourite creature. As you may recall from a previous video of mine, there is actually a long history of colonial appropriating of the Thunderbird, and some consider it a kind of cryptid on the same level as Bigfoot or something. The Wampus is a Cherokee myth about a woman who was transformed into a half-cat, half-human monstrosity and now represents the prophetic spirit of death and the earth. And yet, similar to the Thunderbird, the legend is dismissed entirely beyond being the embodiment of the wizard body and the other white boy's favourite creature. Christ, how do you fuck up this bad? The others are just kind of horrifically ignorant and tone-deaf, but not to the same extent, most likely because there's less information about them. They suffer from many of the same issues that plague the 2 we've just covered, so I'll be brief going over them here so as to avoid repeating myself. The Japanese school, Mahutukoro, covers all of Asia apparently, though it pulls from pretty much exclusively Japanese culture, and likewise the Brazilian one, Castelo Bruxo, covers all of South America and seems to operate on the principle that South America is just jungles. There's not much more to say about it than that, or at least that hasn't already been said, to be honest. Oh, I guess other than the fact that the name Mahutukoro is composed of the Japanese words maho, meaning magic, witchcraft or sorcery, and tokoro, meaning place, spot or site, meaning that it literally translates as magical place or place where magic occurs, and Castelo Bruxo is derived from the Portuguese word castelo, meaning castle, and bruxo, meaning wizard, thus literally translating as wizard castle. Oh, and of course it being in Portuguese likely means that it was probably started by colonizers. Again, incredibly lazy. To be honest, like, why isn't Hogwarts called Magic School by that logic? I mean, the answer is allegedly because European and American lore gets more effort put into it because the author doesn't give a shit about non-white cultures, but people really don't want to accept that or let go of Harry Potter at all, so this will probably just continue until millennials finally find another book. So basically when we're all gone, I guess.
You're a fucking wizard! I don't give a fuck, you fat, hairy bastard! I'm not a fucking wizard! Listen, Harry, you're going to go to Hogwarts and do spells and shit, and you're gonna be fucking pleased about it! I don't want to do your fucking spells, you basket case! Stick it up your fucking dick hole!
J.K. Rowling, in my opinion, is a bigot and has recently just published a book admitting that she knows that but doesn't care. According to her, anyone who cares or criticises art through a modern perspective and examines potentially harmful themes or messaging in children's media is a terminally online mentally ill snowflake, and it's ridiculous to claim that something using centuries-old anti-Semitic stereotypes and featuring just one canon Jewish character called Goldstein, whose Jewishness is never alluded to or mentioned within the text, might be a touch problematic, for example. In my opinion, it's important to go back and reevaluate this old media in light of more recent revelations, and when it comes to anti-LGBTQ+ bigotry, well, let's be honest here, it's got a lot of overlap with other forms of prejudice. Transphobes usually end up also dabbling in homophobia, and likewise homophobes are, by and large, not the biggest fans of non-white people. And of course, as you're almost certainly aware by now, the end result of most bigotry is the cultural Marxism conspiracy theory, which means, of course, anti-Semitism. Generally, such extreme bigotry is the purview of the far right, and as it turns out, many of Rowling's fellow gender-critical people and groups have received a lot of funding and support from mostly American far-right groups like the Anti-Gay, Anti-Abortion Heritage Foundation, and Rowling herself runs a charity with a conservative baroness who openly opposes gay marriage and repeatedly voted against it when it was raised in 2014. Funny how that works, eh?
Yeah, racism sucks! Racism sucks! Racism sucks! Fuck that shit! Fuck that shit! Fuck that shit! I'm tired of this shit! I'm tired of this goddamn shit! Tired of these centuries of mother